Okay, guys, welcome to our podcast, Key Issue number 3. We're going to look at distribution of business services, okay, and the distribution pattern set up by these business services. Just understand that when we talk about distribution pattern, remember you guys were talking about how it's laid out in a given area, how it's spread out, or how it's clustered within a given area. When we talk about the distribution of business services, when we talk about distribution pattern, we want to make sure that you guys understand it's a little bit more disproportionately clustered in a handful of urban settlements. So we tend to see them more in the urban settlements, and in some urban settlements are going to dominate these business services. So it's very disproportionately clustered in a handful of urban settlements is what you'd want to write down for the distribution pattern. Hierarchy of business services. Anytime we talk about hierarchy, we're talking about a rank order. So in this case, the hierarchy of business services is a rank order of the most important business service cities within a given area. Okay, so make sure you get that down. When we talk about hierarchy of business services, we're talking about the rank order of the most important business service cities within a given area. We can do this again by the world, which is what we're going to show you today. But we can also break it down by continent, by region, by country. You get the idea. So we're talking about this rank order process of the most important business service cities within a given area. In this case, we're going to be looking at the world. Looking at page 443, which we'll turn to in a second. What you're going to find out, and this is what you can write down, is a global city. And we're going to take a look at some of these global cities and the different levels at which these global cities exist. Page 443 will show you this, but before you do that, why don't you get the definition here, where a global city is basically a few cities or a small percentage of cities in the world that control the flow of information and capital in the world. So we're talking about a small percentage of cities in the world that have a lot of control, you guys, over the flow of information or the spread of information and capital in the world. Again, I told you we'd look at page 443 here, and we will take a look at that. Make sure you use your book to look at it yourself. What you're going to see right here is you're going to see the different types of global cities that exist. We go alpha is in red, beta is in a purple color right here, and gamma is kind of in that orangish color. So that's going to be your global city hierarchy, and you're going to meet from there. And then there's all other cities too. So these are some of the major cities like we talked about that, where you're going to see a lot of business services are clustered in and around these cities. The red, the alpha, is going to be where you see the most powerful economic settlement, you guys, taking place, and then it'll work its way through the orange, where it has a significant enough impact that we're still going to mention it, but we'll break that down here in our notes. So make sure you refer back to 443, because it does a really good job of showing you the world right now and just the different types of global cities and their ranking that they're given. That's what we want you to look at. Now, there's 3 categories of global cities, okay? Technically, as we showed you, and I'll look at it again, technically, and this is what you want to write down, there's 3 categories of global cities, but I want you to be aware that technically there's more, as there are various degrees of each, okay? So there's various degrees of each one of these 3. That's what you can write down. There's a various degree for each one of these 3 types that we're going to talk about, or these 3 categories that we're going to talk about. So when we make reference to alpha, for example, this is going to be our highest. But I want you to understand that all the cities in red are indicated as being alpha, but as we look at our map right here, the bigger the circle, the more influence that they're going to have, the higher hierarchy they have, the greater the hierarchy they have, you guys, in regards to that. So you can see you have alpha plus plus, which would be places like New York, London, which is very hard to see just because it's so clustered right there. And then you can see the smaller dots of red are still alpha cities, so they're still important, you guys, but they don't have the sheer mass and magnitude of an alpha plus plus. So there's different degrees of intensity for each one of these 3 categories or types of global cities that exist. I think that's important to mention. Now, just looking at the 3 categories and not trying to go further out from there, because I've already given you the disclaimer, When we talk about an alpha city, these are cities that, when we talk about alpha cities, these are cities that serve as the most important link to the world's economy. So these are cities that serve as the most important link to the world's economy. That means they are going to be the city of champions, I guess, if you want to say it that way. They're going to be the biggest, the greatest, the strongest, the most economically and service-wide diverse cities that you'll find in the world. New York City, I mentioned earlier, is a good example of this. Okay, so New York City, London is another one as well where we'll find this alpha plus plus. But this is probably the best example of a global city would be New York City. Beta. Beta cities, these are cities that serve as a direct link in connecting some of the larger economic regions into the world's economy. So when we talked about alpha, again, we said this is an important link. This is an extremely important link to connecting the world's economy. I mean, it's there, it's out there, it's the forefront. Beta is just a little bit less, but it still has a purpose and an important responsibility. Anytime you talk about beta cities, again, we're talking about cities that serve as a direct link in connecting some of the larger economic regions in the world. Now, I emphasize the word larger because that's really important that you get that definition in there because we're talking about larger economic regions into the world's economy. Houston is a primary example of this, and we'll go back and look at it after we talk about each one of these. But Houston is a great U.S. example of a beta city. Gamma cities, these are cities that link some of the smaller economic regions. And again, notice I emphasize the word smaller. That's the only difference in definition between beta and gamma, is that gamma cities are cities that link some of the smaller economic regions, not quite as powerful of economic regions, into the world's economy. They still have significance, they still have a role, but they're not quite to the level of a beta city like a Houston, and definitely not at the level of an alpha city like a New York City. Phoenix is a great example of this. And again, we just take a look at our map right here, you guys, pointing out those cities that we talked about. New York right here, majorly important, you guys, to the world's economy, has been forever. You got the stock market there. We still have most of the world's international trading is set up in and around this area. Of course, we had the tragedy of the World Trade Center, but for many years that could be a symbolizing piece to it. And there's other pieces that we're going to talk about it too. So New York is just a major player in compared to other cities or even other global cities of the world. And then we talked about beta, connecting a large economic region. Houston, right here in red, is a very important one because it really brings together the economic vitality of this region right here, especially focusing on oil, of course, because of its location in Texas and its nearness to the Gulf of Mexico and its nearness and proximity to Louisiana. So that's an example of a smaller type of city that we're looking at right here. So taking a look right here in purple, excuse me, I think I said red, but right here in purple. And then when we talked about the Gamma City, if we just go straight west from there, you guys will come in contact with the Phoenix area. And Phoenix is getting larger and larger, and many people are predicting that perhaps in due time it might elevate its status to a beta. So cities can improve their stock or lower their stock too in regards to the labeling of these certain cities, and that might be important to know as well. The hierarchy, how do we come to this hierarchy? Okay, I kind of talked about it a little bit already, saying the difference, how do we differentiate between what a global city is, and then how do we differentiate if it's alpha, beta, or gamma? Well, the economic factors has one thing to do with it. What we look at with economic factors, and you might just want to write down some keywords here to make it a little bit easier for you to understand. When determining the hierarchy, we look at for economic factors, we look at multinational corporations. We look at financial institutions and law firms that have a direct, really powerful corporations, financial institutions, and law firms that have a real direct impact, not just on that region's economy, but on the world's economy as a whole. Political factors is another thing that we consider. When we talk about political factors, usually this could be a capital city, but it doesn't always have to be because, of course, we know that neither Houston, which is, again, a very important beta city, and New York City, which is the alpha of all alpha global cities, you guys, are not the capitals of their respective states or their countries. But when we look at New York City, it does host, when we talk about political factors, we're talking about hosting of international headquarters where people of the world come together. And of course, I think many of you know that New York City is the official headquarters of the United Nations. So we have the official headquarters of the United Nations located in New York City. So that really gives it its political importance as well. And so this is how we're establishing this hierarchy or this ranking of the top global cities in the world. Cultural factors, another thing we look at, it has the presence of all cultural aspects, and some things you might want to put down next to cultural factors would be really, really infamous museums, real famous museums, you guys. You could talk about influential media outlets. Believe it or not, sports facilities is kind of a factor that they look at as well, especially here in the United States. Again, doesn't mean you have to like sports, but it really is a major moneymaker, as many of you know. So we do look at that service that is offered over a multi-billion-dollar industry, for example, every Sunday in the NFL, and those teams and those owners and those athletes. And so we look at that. Also, you guys, highly regarded academic institutions, really, really top-notch educational facilities is another thing that they look at, especially post-secondary when we're talking about universities and other institutions like that. So cultural factors is another phrase or factor that kicks in. Also, their infrastructure. You look at their infrastructural factors or just simply their infrastructure. Major international airports, you usually see them here. Of course, New York, when you're thinking about this, just have New York City on your mind, you guys, and it'll make sense. And some of the top healthcare facilities in the world are also located in or around that city and its respective suburbs. So again, this is kind of what helps create that hierarchy of the most important global cities, and it helps us to diversify or classify those global cities into alpha, beta, and gamma based on the amount of things and the influence that these things have in regards to these four key characteristics. Consumer services extend beyond population of the market. That's one of the things you need to understand about a global city as well, you guys, is that consumer services, we talked about this the other day when we were talking about the spread of consumer services. The larger the settlement, the more services that are offered. Well, this goes beyond that, because the reason why is what we found out and what these geographers have found out in their studies next to consumer services extend beyond population in the market. What the geographers have found out is they found out that essentially wealthier people live in higher ranking global cities, okay? So the wealthiest percentage of the population will live in places like New York City. As a result of that, you guys, they're going to offer more consumer services, not just because of population, which is extremely important, and the number of potential customers, but also the ability for those potential customers to pay for various services. And so if you have the wealthy, you have a large population, and then you have a lot of wealthy people that live within that population, you're going to see more and more consumer services being offered. So New York City, again, being an alpha plus plus, is going to be a great example of this. One of the things I found in your book, and I didn't know this until I read in the book, is that New York City actually has more theaters than the whole country combined. And in theaters, we look at I use theaters as an example simply because people have the ability to pay, they're willing and they're able to pay for that type of service that isn't really needed for survival as much, but it is needed for maybe the quality of one's life or the enjoyment of one's life, and wealthier people usually can throw their money into those sorts of things than anywhere else. So I did not know that they have more theaters than the rest of the country combined, but that makes sense when we talk about the fact that wealthier people tend to gravitate to higher ranking global cities such as the Alpha Plus Plus in New York City. Okay, that concludes part one of the podcast, you guys. We got a part two coming your way. It'll be much, much shorter, but I know that a lot of you like to do that. And part two is going to consist of business services in developing countries. So again, we'll drift away a little bit, but just understand the concept of global cities, you guys, the factors that help us be able to rank these cities in the way that we do. So with that being said, get ready for the second part of the podcast, but this concludes podcast number one, key issues number 3, when we're talking about services and settlements, and again, and how they relate to one another. Have a good night, and we'll have podcast 2 up shortly. Bye.